My name is Caroline Mason. I'm 27 years old and I was born and raised on a modest family farm in Lincoln, Nebraska. For the past 5 years, I've been living in Chicago chasing my passion as a freelance artist, painting murals, hosting small gallery shows, and scraping by with the unpredictable rhythm of an artist's life. I thought I had finally built something of my own, something far from the long, dusty rows of cornfields and the expectations of small-town life. But when I opened the email from my mother that afternoon, sitting in my tiny studio apartment surrounded by unfinished canvases and the smell of turpentine, something inside me shifted. Lucas's wedding is next month. It would mean a lot if you came back home. Just that no punctuation, no warmth, no acknowledgement of the years I had been gone or the space that had grown between us. It wasn't a request. It was a statement, a subtle tug of obligation that felt both familiar and impossible to ignore. I stared at the screen, my hand hovering over the reply button, but I couldn't bring myself to type a single word. Instead, I stared out the window at the hazy Chicago skyline, wondering how I had ended up so far from home, and yet not far enough to escape it completely. It was late June when I finally arrived in Lincoln, the air thick with humidity and the scent of fresh-cut grass. The old highway seemed narrower than I remembered, the familiar landmarks, dilapidated barns, faded billboards for seed companies, rusting pickup trucks parked by gas stations, all pulling me back into a life I had tried so hard to outgrow. The Mason farm came into view as I turned down the gravel road, a cloud of dust trailing behind my car. The fields stretched wide and green under the heavy sky, but the farmhouse itself looked smaller, almost fragile in the afternoon light. Lucas was in the driveway when I pulled up, wiping sweat from his brow with the hem of his shirt. He looked older than I remembered. His face lined his shoulders, tense under the weight of responsibilities I couldn't yet name. He grinned when he saw me, but it was the kind of smile that didn't quite reach the eyes. "Look who finally decided to show up," he called out, his voice carrying across the yard. I stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching under my boots, and took a deep breath. The air smelled like diesel fuel and damp earth tinged with something that felt like regret. "Hey, Lucas," I said, forcing a smile. Inside the farmhouse smelled the same as it always had, coffee, old wood, and the faint trace of laundry soap. My mother was in the kitchen, wiping down the counters as if the act of cleaning could hold the chaos at bay. She glanced up when I walked in, her expression neutral. "Caroline," she said, like she was acknowledging a distant relative, not her own daughter. "Hi, Mom," I replied quietly. Dinner that evening felt like a performance everyone had forgotten to rehearse for. Lucas talked about the wedding plans, caterers, table settings, a live band, and my parents nodded along, chiming in with suggestions and reminders. I sat silently watching the easy flow of conversation, feeling like an outsider at my own family's table. At one point, I mentioned a mural project I had recently completed in Chicago, my voice tentative. "That's nice," my father said, not looking up from his plate. "You know, Lucas is getting ready to take over the farm. He's been working double shifts just to keep up with the harvest schedule." I stared at my plate, the words sinking in like stones. After dinner, I helped clear the dishes, moving through the motions while the hum of the dishwasher filled the space where conversation should have been. As I loaded plates into the sink, I overheard my parents talking in the next room, voices low but urgent. "We can't keep delaying James," my mother whispered. "The bank's been calling again. We're behind on the loan, and Lucas can't do it all." I froze the plate in my hands, slick with soap and water. My heart pounded in my ears. "Caroline doesn't need to worry about that," my father replied firmly. "This is a family matter." A cold knot formed in my stomach. It was clear in that unspoken way families have that I wasn't part of the equation. I wasn't considered family in the same way Lucas was. That night I lay awake in my old bedroom, staring at the ceiling fan as it creaked with every slow rotation. The walls were still covered in faded wallpaper, and the same childhood books sat untouched on the shelves. I had come back for a wedding, but what I found was something far more complicated. A family in quiet crisis, a farm on the brink, and a feeling I had tried for years to outrun, but never quite could. As the cicadas droned outside, I knew I had a choice to make. I could stay on the sidelines, just another guest at Lucas's perfect wedding, or I could find a way to help, even if it meant doing it in my own way, on my own terms. The question was, Would they ever let me? I woke before the sun, the soft gray light just beginning to seep through the thin curtains of my childhood bedroom. The ceiling fan creaked above me, its rhythmic hum almost matching the pulse in my temples. I lay there for a moment listening until the faint rumble of an engine drifted in from outside. Pushing back the covers, I stood by the window and peered out. In the early morning mist, I saw Lucas in the driveway bent over the hood of the old John Deere tractor. His sleeves were rolled up, grease smeared across his forearm. The tension in his posture was unmistakable, shoulders hunched, movements clipped like he was fighting the machine and the weight of the world all at once. It struck me then, more sharply than it ever had before, Lucas wasn't invincible. He wasn't the flawless, untouchable brother I'd always seen through the eyes of a younger sibling. He was exhausted. I threw on a sweater and stepped outside the morning air, damp and cool against my skin. The gravel crunched beneath my boots as I approached him, but Lucas didn't look up. "Morning," I said, my voice awkward in the quiet. "Hey," he grunted, not taking his eyes off the engine. For a moment I just watched him work, the steady clink of tools filling the space between us. I wanted to ask him if he was okay, but the words caught in my throat, heavy with years of unspoken things. Inside the house, Mom was already bustling in the kitchen, the smell of coffee and frying bacon filling the air. The radio played softly, an old country song about harvest moons and small-town pride. She glanced up briefly when I walked in, then returned to her cooking as if I were just another piece of furniture in the background. "Breakfast will be ready soon," she said. "Thanks," I murmured, but she was already focused on flipping the bacon. Over the next few days, the pattern repeated itself. Lucas worked long hours in the fields and barns, his presence like a constant shadow across the farm. Mom busied herself with wedding details, floral arrangements, seating charts the color of napkins for the reception. I floated on the edges, helping where I could, but always feeling like a guest in a place that had once been home. It wasn't until the third day that I finally caught Lucas alone, sitting on the porch steps as the sun set, his elbows resting on his knees. The sky was streaked with pink and gold, the fields glowing under the fading light. "You ever feel like you're just treading water?" he asked suddenly, his voice low and hoarse. I blinked, surprised by the question. All the time, I admitted, settling beside him. Lucas let out a long breath, rubbing the back of his neck. "This farm? It's not what it used to be. We're behind on payments, the equipment's breaking down, and now the wedding's draining every last cent we have. I'm just holding it together with duct tape and prayers." The rawness in his voice cracked something open in me. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, the question coming out sharper than I intended. He glanced at me, his expression tired but honest. "Because you've got your own life, Caroline. You're out there doing your thing in the city. I didn't want to drag you into this mess." I looked away, feeling both guilt and frustration swirl inside me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The image of Lucas hunched over that tractor burned into my mind. The next morning, I wandered down to the old barn, its paint peeling, the wood sagging in places. I ran my fingers over the worn surface, the grain of the wood rough against my skin. My sketchbook was in my bag, almost forgotten, but I pulled it out on instinct and began to draw. Lines flowed onto the page fields, stretching wide sunflowers swaying in the breeze, children laughing as they ran between rows of corn. The barn wasn't just a barn anymore. In my mind's eye, it became a canvas, a stage, a place for stories to live. An idea sparked a bold, half-formed thought that maybe, just maybe, I could do more than just stand on the sidelines. That evening at dinner, I spoke up. What if we used the barn for community events, like art workshops, farm-to-table dinners, music nights? We could draw people in, make the farm a place where the community comes together. It could help with the bills. Maybe even save the place. Silence followed, so sharp and immediate it was almost tangible. Dad's fork clinked against his plate. He set it down, deliberately looking at me with an expression I knew all too well. "This farm isn't an art gallery, Caroline," he said, his voice flat and final. "It's a working farm. We don't have time for whatever it is you're dreaming up." I felt the familiar sting in my chest, a flush of heat rising to my face. For a moment, I considered backing down, swallowing my idea like I'd done so many times before. But instead, I looked at Lucas. his eyes darting between us, uncertainty flickering across his face, and I made a quiet promise to myself I wouldn't give up this time. After dinner, I stepped out onto the porch, the night air cool against my skin. The stars hung low and bright over the fields, and the cicadas sang their endless song. I sat on the steps, clutching my sketchbook, the ideas swirling faster, now refusing to be silenced. A small voice interrupted my thoughts. "Can I see what you're drawing?" I turned to see a little boy, maybe 7 or 8, standing barefoot on the porch, his eyes wide with curiosity. He was holding a dandelion, its seeds drifting away in the breeze. I smiled, flipping the sketchbook around so he could see. "Wow," he whispered, his eyes sparkling. "Can I draw too?" For the first time since I came back, my heart felt lighter. I handed him a pencil. "Of course," I said. And just like that, something shifted. The next morning, I sat on the porch steps with my sketchbook in my lap, the wood cool beneath me as the first light of day broke across the fields. The little boy from the night before Ethan, I'd learned, sat cross-legged beside me, gripping a crayon in one small hand and carefully outlining a sun in the corner of his paper. Watching him, something stirred deep in my chest. It was a fragile thing, like the first green shoot pushing through soil after a long winter. I thought about what Lucas had said about the farm barely holding together, about the debt hanging over us like a storm cloud. I thought about the way my parents looked at me, like I was still the girl who had walked away, not the woman who had fought for her own dreams. I glanced at the barn, its paint faded and peeling, the wood slats warped from years of weather. But when I squinted just right, I could almost see it transformed, strings of lights draped from the rafters, tables set with handmade crafts and local produce, laughter spilling into the night air. Maybe it wasn't just a barn, maybe it could be something more. I spent the rest of that day moving through the farm like someone seeing it for the first time. I walked the perimeter of the fields, feeling the sun warm my face and the dry grass scratch at my ankles. I took notes, snapped photos with my phone, sketched rough layouts for the barn in my notebook. Inside the barn, I ran my hands over the rough wood walls, imagining the murals I could paint, scenes of harvests past, of families working the land of the Nebraska prairie in all its golden glory. My fingers itched to pick up a brush. Later that afternoon, I sat down at the kitchen table with Mom, who was folding napkins for the wedding reception. I took a deep breath and tried again. "Mom, I've been thinking, what if we hosted community events here? Art classes for kids, maybe a small farmer's market, local crafts, people love that stuff. We could turn the barn into something that draws people in, not just for the wedding, but long term. It could help with the debt." She didn't look up from the napkins. "That's not realistic, Caroline. This is a farm, not a community center. We don't have time for your big ideas." Her words landed like a slap, but I tried to keep my voice steady. "It's not just my idea. Other towns have done it. It could work." Lucas walked in just then, sweaty and dirt-streaked from working in the fields. He caught the tail end of our conversation and froze, a wary look crossing his face. "You're serious about this?" he asked, his tone half skeptical, half curious. I nodded, heart pounding. "Yes, I think it's worth a shot." But before I could say more, Dad's voice boomed from the doorway. "Enough." He barked, his face flushed with frustration. "This farm is not some arts and crafts project, Caroline. We don't need a circus here. We need real solutions, not pipe dreams." The room went silent. I stared down at my sketchbook, my fingers gripping the edges until my knuckles ached. Lucas shifted uncomfortably, glancing between us, but said nothing. After dinner, I slipped out of the house and found myself back in the barn. The air smelled of hay and old wood, of generations of sweat soaked into the walls. I sat on an overturned crate, the sketchbook open in my lap, and let the pencil move. My hands worked almost without thinking, lines flowing into shapes, sunflowers bending in the breeze, children playing beneath the wide Nebraska sky, hands reaching across tables piled with harvest goods. The barn wasn't just a building. It was a symbol of what this place could be. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the barn cast long, warm shadows across the field. I heard footsteps crunching the gravel, and when I looked up, Ethan stood in the doorway, his eyes wide with wonder. "Can I help you paint it someday?" he asked. I smiled, something steadying inside me for the first time in days. "Yeah, kid," I said softly. "I think you can." The sky darkened faster than I expected. One moment the fields shimmered under a golden sunset, and the next clouds gathered thick and heavy, turning the air electric with tension. I stood in the barn doorway with Ethan at my side, our sketches scattered across the floor when the first crack of thunder split the evening quiet. The wind picked up, suddenly rustling the dried corn stalks and rattling the old barn walls. I could hear the distant hum of a weather alert from the radio in the kitchen. Lucas's voice rang out from the yard, sharp and urgent. "Caroline, get the tools inside. This storm's moving in fast." I didn't hesitate. Ethan and I scrambled to gather our supplies, our papers fluttering away like leaves. The wind tore at my hair, whipping it into my face, and the smell of rain, sharp, earthy, inevitable, filled the air. Lucas sprinted toward the barn, his boots slapping against the muddy ground. His face was tight with worry, sweat mixing with the first drops of rain. "I told you this thing was coming," he muttered, yanking at a tarp that flapped wildly in the wind. Together we fought to pull it over the exposed equipment. The storm hit with sudden, brutal force. Rain lashed sideways, soaking us within seconds. I could barely see the water stinging my skin, and my heart pounded in my chest as I struggled to hold the tarp down. Lucas cursed under his breath, gripping the edges as the wind threatened to rip it free. "Help me," he shouted, and I grabbed hold, my fingers slipping against the slick fabric. For a moment it felt like we were in a battle against something ancient and untamable. The barn groaned under the force of the storm, its old beams trembling as if they might give way. In the chaos, I caught a glimpse of Dad standing on the porch, arms crossed tightly, watching us struggle but not moving to help. Mom hovered behind him, her hands clasped, worry etched into her features. Something inside me snapped. This was the problem. The weight of the farm, the burden of responsibility, it was all on Lucas, and it wasn't fair. It wasn't sustainable. As the storm raged around us, I felt my resolve harden. I wasn't going to let this place fall apart. Not like this. Not when I could see the cracks so clearly. When the worst of the wind finally passed, we stood breathless and soaked the tarp, barely clinging to the equipment. The fields were a muddy mess, and the barn had lost part of its roof. Lucas let out a ragged breath, bending over with his hands on his knees. His chest heaved, and I saw for the first time the exhaustion in every line of his face. "I can't keep doing this, Caroline," he admitted, his voice hoarse. "I'm trying, but it's too much." The honesty in his words hit me harder than the storm. I took a step closer, my voice low but steady. "Then let me help. Not just patching up broken boards, but really help. We can make this place more than what it's been. We have to try." He stared at me for a long moment, the rain dripping from his hair, his shoulders slumped. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded once. That night, after the storm passed and the air smelled clean and sharp, I sat in the barn, the broken roof above me framing a patch of starry sky. My sketchbook lay open, pages damp but still intact. I began to draw, not just for myself, but for all of us. The next morning, I put my plan into action. I designed a flyer on my laptop, simple but bold: the Quiet Harvest Festival art community and local flavors at Mason's farm. Join us for a day of music, food, and creative workshops. I shared it on local Facebook groups, emailed the town's community board, and printed a stack to post at the diner and gas station. When I pinned the first flyer to the bulletin board at Millie's Diner, I felt something click into place. This wasn't just an idea anymore, it was happening. Some people were curious, some skeptical, and others downright dismissive. But a few, like Mrs. Ruth, the retired teacher from down the road, stopped to ask questions. "That sounds lovely," she said, nodding slowly. "Maybe we could use something like that around here." Her words were a spark, small but powerful. Back at the farm, Lucas watched me with an expression that hovered somewhere between uncertainty and hope. Dad kept his distance, muttering about wasting time, while Mom avoided my gaze entirely. But I didn't care. For the first time, I felt like I was steering my own story, and whether they liked it or not, the seeds were planted. Caroline didn't just come back for a wedding. She came back to remember who she was before the world told her who to be. She faced the silence at the family table, the storm on the farm, the weight of years unspoken. And instead of turning away, she stayed, not to fix everything, but to plant something new. The barn wasn't just wood and nails, it was a canvas, a community hub waiting to happen, a place where art and agriculture, creativity and tradition could coexist, not in perfect harmony but in honest effort. Because family isn't just about blood, it's about who shows up when the roof caves in. It's about building something with your own two hands even when no one else can see the blueprint yet. Caroline chose to stay, to fight for a vision no one else could see, to believe in a future bigger than herself, one with kids drawing sunflowers, with music in the fields, with laughter under string lights in an old barn. And what about you? Have you ever gone home to find it wasn't quite home anymore and decided to make it yours anyway? Have you ever faced down doubt, not just from others but from the voice in your own head, and said, "I'm staying, I'm trying, I'm building something that matters"? Share your story in the comments, because your voice, your yes, might be the permission someone else needs to take their first step towards something bold. And if Caroline's journey stirred something inside you, if you've ever been the quiet dreamer in the corner sketching possibilities while everyone else played it safe, follow the channel. We tell stories that don't fit into neat boxes, stories about the messy middle, the quiet rebuilds, the art of starting small, stories that remind us you don't have to wait for permission to matter, you just have to believe enough to begin. You belong here, your story isn't finished yet. And together, we're building something beautiful, one sketch, one seed, one story at a time.